Welcome, everyone, to our Spring Scholars in the Square lecture series. Hello to those of you joining us online and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown, and I am the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. Now, as a reminder, our SITS lectures unfold as follows. First, our speaker, Dr. Simi Kang, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then they will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with an interlocutor. Because of my own work in food, politics, and power, as well as the use of food and identity processes for minoritized communities, I actually have the privilege of acting as the interlocutor for Simi today. So after Simi and I talk for 20 minutes, I will chair a 20-minute open discussion period with folks in the room and online. Now, our speaker for today is Dr. Simi Kang. Simi is a mixed white and Sikh settler, educator, scholar, and artist raised on the unceded Dakota lands of Mni Sota Mokoce. They work with Southeast Asian fishers to build environmentally just futures in Bvlbancha, which is coastal Louisiana, and interrogate the role of resilience in climate and immigration policy. Simi is an assistant professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois UrbanaChampaign. Champaign. And a 2025-2026 U of I Humanities Research Institute faculty fellow. Simi has produced impressive scholarly contributions to academic publications, as well as publicly accessible sources such as magazines and blogs. And one chapter of particular note is Simi's Eating Ancestrally, Resisting with and Learning from Our Family's Foodways, and I highly recommend this piece in a collection in Eating More Asian American, where they beautifully incorporate their research with storytelling and personal memories. Simi's work and their talk today directly address the ways we relate to and through the lands on which we live, work, and play. Their work on resistance movements and explorations of community survival through the lens of foodways, food practice, and land reminds us of the ways that community resilience and self-understanding often come out of and through embodied experience. Embodied experience that cannot be separated out from the lands on which our bodies move. And so I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Wosefsa Musqueamot peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Simi.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that generous introduction. I think I have marshaled the camera to myself, or not quite. Am I not projecting enough, perhaps?
Maybe slide closer to Rachel.
So thank you all so much for coming, and thanks to those of you on Zoom. I will begin by saying that I am neither foundationally a religious studies scholar or a food studies scholar, but you are seeing me bring those things together today. My background is in cultural anthropology and feminist studies, and I am an ethnic studies scholar. So kind of bringing a bunch of different things together today, and this is going to be much more storytelling than it is going to be theoretical. So hopefully that gives us some inroads into having conversations together about your experiences too, not just mine. And I will be reading today for all of your sake. It's finals for us still, and I am grading, and my brain is soup. So for everybody's sake, I wrote all the words. Feel free to let me know if I'm going off topic or over time. So I was raised on stolen Dakota land called Mni Sota Mokoce near the sacred confluence. Sorry, I also have this awful cough that I can't get rid of. Near the sacred confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers called Bvlbancha. And you all might be aware of this place in the world right now because it's one of the places that ICE has continued to use to house people after sweeping the Twin Cities, and is a sacred site of interring Indigenous. Like, it's an Indigenous sacred site, and it is a site where Indigenous people were and continue to be interred. And so this confluence is remarkably important historically and in an ongoing way for the Dakota Lakota people and for the people of the Twin Cities. My people are white settlers to these lands and Punjabi Sikh settlers as well as Punjabi Sikhs and a number of settler diasporas, including within India. My paternal grandparents were internal refugees at the partition of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. They were farmers and believed in our interdependence with the land. I'm an ethnographer and feminist scholar. I work with Vietnamese and Khmer American fisher folk on the stolen lands of the Homa, the Takapa, Ishik, and Biloxi people, colonially called Louisiana. Following Fisher's expertise and organizers of the global majority, I think about environmental racism, refugeeism, ecosystem restoration, and the violence of resilience in policy. So I always wanted to be a food scholar, and that's kind of how we're getting here. I started my ethnographic research in Bvlbancha, colonially called New Orleans, in 2015. And I know a lot of people know these geographies, but when I'm in Canada, I think it's important to locate Louisiana and to locate New Orleans. So unfortunately, I don't think I have a pointer, but you all can see Louisiana in bright red in the Gulf of Mexico. And on the lower right-hand side, there is a smaller map of the state of so-called Louisiana, where you know, I think for everybody's sake, I'm not going to do that. You can see, please move. You can see a large lake on the toe of the boot, and that is roughly where Bvlbancha, New Orleans is. So it is already essentially in the Gulf. And that land is very, very porous. So I started field work in Bvlbancha in 2015 by working at Veggie, an urban farm that Vietnamese American youth created after the BP oil catastrophe in 2010, forced many of their elders who relied on commercial shrimping, oystering, and crabbing to find alternative income. I'm so sorry. When I started fieldwork, I thought I was in the Gulf to learn about food as a racialized and disciplinary technology. After 2005's Hurricane Katrina and attendant levee breaches, I no longer advance the slides.
It'll go down.
Oh, there we go. After Hurricane Katrina and attendant levee breaches, journalists used the so-called boom and the visibility of Vietnamese restaurants in the region to tell a story that positioned the community forced from Vietnam by US war as more resilient or able to survive worse conditions with less than their Black and Latino neighbors. After refugeeism from Vietnam in the 1970s and 80s and a local resettlement process that placed refugees at the edge of the city where it was remarkably difficult to access social services, families have been forced to build support networks that made collective rebuilding more feasible after Katrina's floods than in neighborhoods without that history. So people not having the resources they need forced them to create the resources they needed for themselves, right? And this was used to further racialize other racialized residents of Louisiana. This idea that refugees of US war are more resilient to the violences of disaster and displacement than others because of their refugeeism has been formalized across many registers of Louisiana policy, largely via absence. It shows up as a lack of monies, a lack of plans and structures allocated to the community's future, be it before, during, or in the wake of a myriad disasters that hit the region. So the hurricane preparedness policy is these people will survive, essentially. Right? I call this particular strain of structural violence refugee resilience, a concept that I could only see clearly when I was doing the everyday work of creating food security in spite of the city, the state, and the nation with Vietnamese American elders and young people. And all the other elders who grew at Veggie for their income had formerly been commercial shrimpers and crabbers who relied on the routinely poisoned and desecrated coast for their incomes. The BP oil catastrophe made it particularly difficult for them to continue working. And when lawyers showed up to give people repayments, all of the documents that people had to sign were in English. So a lot of people lost an absurd amount of money and resources and repayment after BP, after Katrina, because of language access issues as well, right? So these things are leveraged against the community kind of at every turn. So over time, because of the farm, because of the elders, because it was so clear that fishing was so essential to the community and that food technologies were the way that they were making way. I transitioned from working with the land to discussing restoration policy from the vantage of Vietnamese and Khmer shrimping boats, which forced me to drop food preparation and consumption as a central analytic of my scholarship. My dissertation took shape at the intersections of critical refugee studies, environmental justice, restoration policy, and US imperialism. However, living in Bvlbancha, where European colonial powers competed to discipline swampland into crown-worthy agricultural production via the trafficking and forced labor of West African and Caribbean families, where both okra and sassafras are used to thicken gumbo, but in very different kitchens, and where tourists go exclusively to eat, forced me to think deeply about what food means in practice and what it means for us as practice of our identities, our histories, and our lineages, what we remember and what we are forced to forget, particularly in diaspora. So the transatlantic slave trade in Caribbean and Pacific plantation economy, settler colonial extractivism, the Indian Removal Act, Jim Crow, the coolie trade, and industrialization and oil, forever war and more has shaped how Bvlbancha eats, but more, the ways food is used here, right? And this is a photo of like an above ground gravesite, which is necessary because the water table is so high. Above ground gravesite with an oil refinery as its background, and then you see the Mississippi River just a bit further away, right? So, and the Mississippi River is the major artery of the United States. 40% of the fresh water in the contiguous United States drains from the Mississippi. So one facility along that water route is poisoning so much, right? And it is the legacy. These are former plantations that turned into oil refineries. So the legacy of these harms are so baked into the land that they have been forcibly forgotten. So over time, I noticed that it was a place where the living used food to connect to the dead. Through generations, First Nations and the descendants of enslaved people have used plants and foodstuffs to reconnect to and build vernacular practices under shifting colonialisms and imperialisms. In so doing, they refuse the Western biopolitical framework that so often mediates our relationship with our communal histories and our cultural practices. In her book, If I Can Cook, oh, sorry, here's another. This is a still from a reenactment of a rebellion of enslaved peoples along the highway, along the river that is now highway, that is now the plantation is seen. 1812, the largest rebellion of enslaved peoples in the United States happened along this region. And I was actually paddling along the Mississippi during this happening. So there's like this really fascinating sort of rupture that these enactments forced. So in her book, If I Can Cook, You Know God Can, celebrated poet and griot Ndusake Shange asks, what did Haitian revolutionary leaders Louverture, Pétion, and Dessalines share for their victory dinner, realizing they were the first African nation, slave-free in the New World? What did Bolivar crave as independence from Spain became evident? What was the last meal of the defiant Incan Atahualpa before the Spaniards made a public spectacle of his defeat? How did we consecrate our newfound liberty? By trying to imagine what revolutionaries were craving as they achieved these world-shaping goals, Shanga is storing food as not only essential to African diasporic and Black revolution, but as a connective tissue that maintains generational struggle. She's speaking about more than food here, though. This quote is most centrally about faith. Faith in not just one's own sovereignty of self, but one's connection to the land, to one's ancestors and their practices, to a future where a restoration of those relationships might be possible. My ancestors in India did not have their relationship to the land severed in the same way as the revolutionary Shanga writes about. The British Raj, the partition of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, the Green Revolution, and so much more was meant to distance Punjabis, my people are from their relationship with the land, but contemporaneously forced and allowed them to also fight for its well-being. It wasn't just a refusal. For Sikhs whose relationship to the land is directly connected to their and our faith, Food has long been a site of resistance to colonization, conversion, genocide, and patriarchal violence, including casteism. As a mixed monolingual child growing up in the US Midwest, where most of my neighbors were white, I only learned about Sikhi in bits and pieces, overwhelmingly when my father and I visited our family farm in Uttarakhand during childhood holiday breaks. Both of my grandparents were refugees of partition. I was looking for the time, I can't see it. Oh, okay. They fled Lahore as the border moved across it and ended up on the other side of the continent, clearing jungle, and the new government sold refugees for cheap to make farmland. As a child, all I knew was that my grandparents had made a lovely life for their 5 children by tending the land. During our holidays, oh, sorry, I don't know how we got here. Skipped a bunch of different slides. Oh, shoot. Huh. Whatever's loaded, I don't think is. I think I might have, or maybe yeah. Okay, well, you all don't get more pictures. That's the end. I'm so sorry. Now you just have to listen to me, which is so much more boring, but I will try to be interesting. During our holidays, the whole family would gather every morning and evening to walk the length of the farm. We'd search for the leopard my uncle convinced us lived in the mango grove. He did, and I think it did. I think it was real. Pick guava from the trees and watch as workers planted mustard and showed sugarcane across open swaths of land. As we walked, my father and his siblings would tell stories, and my cousins would chase one another, dodging the farm dog who darted through the dikes that crosscut each field to chase birds and rodents. On those visits, Dadiji, my paternal grandmother, took me to her almost daily trips to our local Gurdwara, which you would have a picture of, where Sikhs worship. Each ritual, from walking barefoot on cold white marble, washing my hands under a communal spigot, giving an offering in front of the granth, and eating prasad blessed by the Gyanis, was precious to me. But my favorite part of going to Gurdwara was when we took langar, the 2 times daily vegetarian communal meal that's served to all. After praying, Dadiji and I would head to a long hall where we'd sit on the floor. She would instruct me to hold up my tin plate for the servers as they paced from person to person and dipped a large ladle into buckets full of raita, chana, dal, and sabji before gently placing its contents on our plate. At my family's Gurdwara, langar was never a somber meal. My Dadiji, she had friends everywhere she went. So she would just like sit down and shoot shit with anybody who would show up. And I loved watching these exchanges because even though I didn't know what everybody was saying as a monolingual, unfortunately, it was really clear that we were in family space regardless, right? Like it was family. At the age of 4 or 5, I was starting to understand that being Sikh meant being part of a global family. As I grew up, I learned that this family was formed from and shaped by resistance to oppression, be it via a structural lack of food or, in so many cases, explicit harm. While our families had lived through persistent persecution as religious minorities, Sikhs have always responded by doing seva, or selfless service. Through my life, I've watched national and global Sikh groups like the Sikh Coalition and Khalsa Aid respectively provide legal and resettlement services, food, housing, water, healthcare, and other resources to refugees and communities impacted by disaster globally. For Sikhs like my Dadiji, mandating interpersonal care and the care for all is both a religious tenet and a survival tactic, a compassionate practice that emerged from violence as a way to resist the same. Food is always at its center, be it seva or langar. And sort of the last piece I want to talk about is the farmers' protest. So in March 24, 2020, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced that in 14 hours, the whole country would go into COVID lockdown. As the markets for the rural industries like agriculture became more tenuous in the global COVID-19 economy, hundreds of thousands of people were forced out of work, leaving urban centers for homes several days' walk away. Most of the places where they would be forced to recuperate a stable life relied on agriculture. But during the 21-day lockdown that followed, Modi passed 3 laws that undid farmers' longstanding access to price assurance, which meant that they could always be sure that when they went to market, they would get whatever the minimum price was, right? Like he took away the possibility of a fixed minimum price. For a decade, India's farmers were living under constant threat of suicide, their labor and land so undervalued on the market and so threatened by environmental change that the fixes thereto that like the ways that they have been trying to fix environmental degradation are only making things worse and deteriorating the water table. The new farm laws doubled down on these ongoing and compounding vulnerabilities, essentially telling farmers that while their livelihoods were the backbone of the country and heavily contributed to feeding the world's people, they should not expect to be able to live off of that work, should not hope to make a life from the land they had fought so hard to keep solvent, should in effect be resilient to their own debts on the land that would stave off. They worked to stave off the same. Mni was hoping to bring foreign investors and private money into the agriculture sector, but he was willing to sacrifice the laborers that had made the sector a global force to begin with. This guaranteed vulnerability, institutionalized expendability, sent shockwaves across the nation's agricultural regions. Punjab, the so-called breadbasket of India, where my family's from, began mobilizing. So the movement, now known as the Farmers' Protest, began among Sikh farmers in Punjab and solidified in Delhi, where Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Jain, and many other farmers from around the country converged to block roadways in the capital city. At every blockade, called a morcha by the protesters, which in British English translates to a hostile demonstration against the government, protesters weatherized tractor trailers to sleep in, built massive communal kitchens and laboratories, and erected free stores, libraries, and schools for elders and youth alike. This is all like on major highways in Delhi. When the protesting farmers were beaten with lathis and shot with water cannons on Republic Day, farmers established medical clinics, patched up their wounded, and refused to leave. When Delhi police installed barbed wire walls and tire puncturing spikes around them, farmers nailed down the spikes with shoe heels and planted flowers and herbs in their stead, an act of refusal that made me cry. Clip after clip on social media showed protesters feeding each other and caring for each other. After a year of occupying Delhi's streets, the farmers prevailed and the laws were rescinded for now. For a week, tractors rolled back into Punjab and were greeted by crowds of people dancing, singing, and showering their kin with marigolds and sweets. It wasn't, as some might say, a victory for the tenacious people who had endured heat, monsoon, and near freezing to keep their livelihoods. Rather, they were celebrations of a collective future that had become more possible because of the protesters' insistence on making life with the land and one another. Instead of meeting the demands of the economy to be resilient to their own sacrifice and the sacrifice of the land, my kin used food as a vehicle to teach the world about Siva and that above all else, the whole human race is one. Put differently, following the tenets of Sikhi, they showed that food is resistance made tangible. That what was on the table at the moment of Louverture, Pétion, and Dessalines' victories was significant not just for how it tasted, but from where it grew, by whose hands, and under what conditions. I have one paragraph. Later, in If God Can Cook, Shanga tells us that cooking is a way of insisting on living. When we are hungry for life, we search out spices, aromas, and texture to entice and please those around us. For Shanga, insisting on living in the persistent wake of the transatlantic slave trade and under imperialist white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, to borrow from bell books, looks like returning not just to the tastes, but the very stuff of our memories. And for my ancestors and for my kin, this begins in the field that is fed by the river. It starts in the pecan swamp, and it's of the coastline. Tough. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Simi. Okay, there's so many places I want to go, but
I packed a lot into.
yeah, it's great though, and into this piece that I mentioned as well, which I think everyone should read. I think you know where I want to start is with you. And I was just thinking, you talked a few times about your mixed identity, but also the sort of monolingual experience. And so in some of my work, I've talked about culture being what I call an affair of the tongue, right? Because all cultures have basically language and food to communicate. And so thinking about that and thinking about yourself as a monolingual person, but you understood things through the food. Right. And so I'm curious, what did the language of food communicate to you about Sikhi in those moments?
That's a really good question. I think, so my grandmother passed when I was 12, but she was my very favorite person and we never had language. We never shared language. My grandpa would tell anybody who asked that I taught him English because I would not shut up. He said it lovingly, but she never spoke English. I never spoke Punjabi. And so our entire relationship was gestures and like being with each other. And that overwhelmingly happened in the kitchen, right? So I would follow her around. I was like her little chick, just like following her everywhere she went. And that meant that I was learning about growing food because she had a kitchen garden and we would harvest from that before making dinner, right? She had an outdoor cooking space and an indoor cooking space. And there were folks who worked for our family too, who helped with cooking. So I was around so many people who were doing cooking as the practice of intimacy, love, like making home. And all of those experiences, specifically my grandmother, right? Like she was so deliberate in her belief. And so like she practiced Sikhi, right? As a daily practice. She went to the Gurdwara, she experienced and thought about the ethics and morals and values as a consistent way of engaging with everybody. And so I feel like shadowing her in the kitchen kind of taught me a lot about what her expectations were for how we cared for each other, how we interacted with each other, how we built our family. And I feel like those were kinds of the foundations of the way that like Sikhi was where she started. So it's where the kitchen started. It's where our family started. So it felt like that's how I learned kind of passively, but actively about faith.
And that's beautiful. And in the Gurdwara spaces, in that sort of like Langar Hall, which obviously I can picture so perfectly. I mean, I can picture perfectly because I've seen the pictures and been in many of those spaces. So in those experiences, and in that sort of witnessing of your grandmother in those spaces, did it become evident to you early on and in those moments, or was it not until later when you're thinking about work on food and faith and tradition that you go, oh wait, I see the sort of like Sikh value of seva or equality worked out there? Or was this something that like as a child, maybe this is an impossible question to answer because we always, look back at our own lives anachronistically, but like, was there something about that experience of the Langar that kind of socialized you into kind of a Sikh worldview at that point? Or is it really just looking back at it that you kind of now determined that that's what's...
I think you answered your own question about asking it, right? But in a very helpful way, in that it's a yes and I think consistently. Especially like in the case of this Gurdwara, for example, like there's people Gyanis who are doing the work of cooking, and people who are doing the volunteering to cook. But we also participated in that sometimes. And so like being in the kitchen of the Gurdwara too, or being in the kitchen at home and then like bringing things to community, I think meant that there wasn't really a clear distinction between those things for me. Like when we visited, we were at Gurdwara, we were doing food, and like those things weren't radically distinct. But I think it's only in retrospect looking at, right, I was also quite young. My family all identify as Sikh, but she was the one who consistently. So I think a lot of it I realized in retrospect, or from kind of sitting with, those memories and experiences and learning more on my own, right? Like having to kind of teach myself because my dad is an avowed atheist, and never raised me with faith. And so it's something that I've had to kind of be retroactively learning about the practices of kind of on my own, which the language piece makes that really complicated.
Right, yeah. Okay, maybe we can shift a little bit to, which I think is still tied in, but these ideas of food as consecration, which again, I think is still up here. How do we consecrate, right, our newfound liberty? So that use of consecration is interesting. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what Shangi means by consecration, or how you understand food as like consecration.
Oh gosh.
Why that word?
Yeah, well, I mean, it stands out, right? And
Yeah.
and she so deliberately put it there. Because I think like, I mean, from an anthropological perspective, right? The ways that we deal with the fact of ritual is where we make the most meaning, right? As community, and ritual has an end and a beginning, and it tells us something about ourselves. And so consecration itself is really this fundamental ritual that allows us to do transition work from one moment to the next, and often opens into new worlds, right? It's like you are different after consecration. It is an act of change making. And so I think newfound liberty also, right? Like there's just linguistically, there's so much that she's doing where it's like, it's not that we weren't free before, it's that we had to liberate ourselves. And I think that there are maybe some pieces about the going through that experience, or the act of the ritual of consecration, that is allowing for not a break with the past, but a refusal to return to the conditions that one had to liberate themselves from. And like food allows for us to do that so quietly in so many ways, right? Because we act like people are going to share a meal at this moment regardless, but that meal has meaning because of the moment, because of what they're making of it. And so I think like us, I don't know, food allows for that kind of meaning making along the way, that we're not like, even to your question about Sikh, right? Like you're not even noticing what you're learning from it, or what sort of transitional possibilities are it's allowing, but it's a rupture.
Yeah,
I answered that very poorly.
No, it's okay, because I was gonna try to like guide to that idea of like why food works so well, whether it's for consecration or this idea of even as ancestral work. And so I'd love to hear you a little bit, reflect a little bit more about that, but this idea of the spaces that get opened up through food, or the kind of, you know, if we use Tweed's language, Thomas Tweed, a good religious studies reference in here, but this idea of kind of religion acts as transtemporal and translocative space. And so I've written about how food stands in that way, right? It's this thing that transports us across time and space and opens up the experience to different planes of existence too, that allows for that opening and that possibility. And so I'm wondering with that, if you can reflect a little bit by what you mean about like eating ancestrally or food as ancestral work. Because I think it ties in a little bit to the way that food transports, and how even you personally engage with food in this sort of as ancestral work, or and maybe you can reflect a little bit about your altar as well to get into this.
So the chapter I wrote for Eating More Asian America is really just like a pile of thoughts organized into paragraphs. And
You're underselling.
but it really is, it's focused around like, I have an ancestral altar, which is not a thing Sikhs have, right? Like it's not a thing we are meant to have. We do not we do not do idolatry or idol work, but it is a place that I have produced where I can visit with and talk to my people based on traditions that I have been lucky enough to learn from so many different folks, largely in Vietnam and in New Orleans, where people are doing the kind of like, in Vietnam, I first really learned about altar work, and that was during Tet, which is the, you know, Lunar New Year, and also in Vietnam, it's when folks like visit their dead, are in relationship with. So I was in Dalat, which is a small hill city, and we actually went to, my homestay family was so nice. I don't know why they put up with a bunch of random Americans going with them to honor their dead. But they did, and we were like, we brought cakes and cookies and went to the graves, right? And ate with the dead, and the ancestral altars that were then at the home spaces were in conversation with those spaces. And I just, it became really clear to me that we were allowed to make space, or that space could be made with and for the dead by the living. And that wasn't necessarily something that I had a sense of before that experience. And then living in New Orleans, where I don't know how many of you have been to Bvlbancha in New Orleans, but it's one of those places you either fall in love with immediately or it tells you you're not meant to be there. And it's because it's full, it's just like, it speaks, it's very loud. The water table's close to the, like the ancestors are just very, very present there. And there's so much recuperation work that people are doing there to connect with their ancestors in spite of colonization, in spite of the transatlantic slave trade, where hoodoo and voodoo are sites that people are doing so much interlocking with their dead or with their people in various ways. And food is at the center of that too, right? Like food is so central to hoodoo and voodoo practices. And so is memorializing the dead, right? There's an annual memorial called Ma'afa that happens at Congo Square, and folks go from Congo Square, which was the one place that enslaved people could gather during enslavement once a week to be free, but is now sacred ground that is reclaimed by the descendants of enslaved people. Ma'afa goes from Congo Square to the river itself, which is how people were transited and sold, and honors that. And they talk about all of the things that people grew, how the land was harvested by enslaved people, and the food making practices were the way, right? They were forced to the US. So there are all of these different ways that the land, honoring the land, honors people. Food is so much the tether between those things, right? What we grow, what we make. And all of that for me just came together over time in, I'm going to make a space where I talk to my people, and I'm going to take some of these technologies and thank everybody I learned them from constantly. But in the absence of my own, right? Like everybody's ways of communing with dead are about food and land. And so those are the practices that I was able to kind of like pick up and think with to build an altar practice.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Let's start with end with the revolution, I should say, because we're open at the moment here. So let's end our part of the conversation with revolution. So in your work, you talk about, and I have a quote here, "Isn't survival under impossible conditions always revolutionary?" And so I'm wondering if you can reflect just a little bit more how you've witnessed that in action through food. So how does food help to show survival under impossible conditions and therefore act as kind of the lens through which we see, or honestly, the ground out of which revolution comes?
Well, I mean, some of our, like my friend Shema will tell you that revolution starts at the sink, right? When you do the dishes, right? Like the kitchen itself is a space that is revolutionary. But like caring for each other, right? Food is care work, I think foundationally. Like none of us, everything we eat is touched by other people. And so like it's fundamentally a form of care work, and making sure that folks are resourced such that they can do revolution is kind of the most important thing. So mutual aid is kind of the place I see that really showing up is when we feed people, they are able to actually advocate for their needs. When we resource people, they are able to do the things that make their futures more possible. So one of the ways that I've engaged in that work personally is, I'm from Mni Sota Mokoce. I'm from the Twin Cities. And so in 2020, I was doing a lot of mutual aid work at a distance during the uprising after 4 Minneapolis police officers murdered George Floyd. And it showed me, like, I was a part of a network of people who actually built a map so people could network their mutual aid and figure out where their resources were and figure out where to give resources. and that's been reactivated recently. So those mutual aid networks are good because they stick around and you can use them. So food, right? Like if we start with people need to get fed, then you have to start with, so who needs feeding? Who can do the feeding? Who can do the transit work? Who can make sure that this is culturally appropriate food? Who can make sure that this is the right formula? And how do we do it in a way that doesn't make it harder for ourselves to survive, which is, that's how you build a revolution. Like there's no way to make the radical change that's necessary without people being able to survive fundamentally. Yeah, and so I like the Twin Cities taught me that really fundamentally, and then the farmers' protest was happening at the exact same time that I was doing that mutual aid work. So I was worried about my family in India. I was worried about my family in the Twin Cities, and just seeing like, regardless, these two totally different things that are happening, right, are completely linked by the need for people to care for each other and the need for people to connect to the land and the need for people to defend the place, right? And feeding each other and growing food is kind of the way to do that. So also after or during the uprising, tons of community gardens got started, right? Like that kind of thing, where it's like, what's each individual person seeing their role as? And a lot of people were like, food's my role. I can grow food, I can cook food, I can distribute food. And so it's also a really low bar to entry that I think anybody, like as somebody who doesn't speak anything but English fluently, I can go into someone's kitchen regardless. I mean, if they want me there, obviously with consent. I can go into someone's kitchen with consent and like we can connect without language because there are processes that we know how to do or we're moving toward making a meal.
It's great, thanks. Okay, I have so much more to say, but let's open up to a broader conversation. So Jeff?
Thank you, Simi, for this really searching analysis. That last bit of conversation made me wonder about, I hear mutual aid networks in the city and activist communities, and I hear Gurdwara food. So I'm wondering if you could just put a hit, like you can name how religion impacts these two forms of food and mutual aid.
Yeah. So I'll keep going with the Twin Cities as an example because that's the example that I know the best. The first mutual aid hubs were churches, church basements, right? All of them. There's a pantry at all of the major churches and houses of worship, all the mosques, there's a Gurdwara too. And those were the places that people started, right? Because that was already infrastructure that existed. And then they moved out. Or, people were going to the church organizers and saying, like, how do y'all distribute this? How are you going to, right? Or can we use the church on a Tuesday? You all obviously need it not Tuesday, but can we use it on Tuesday for distribution where families know they can come every single Tuesday from 10 to 5 and get food, right? And so sites of worship, like the Gurdwara, the way it's physically built, it's open north, south, east, and west. Doors are facing all directions to show that everybody's welcome regardless of faith and regardless of what they have access to or don't. So you know that if you walk into a Gurdwara, you will be fed and that you will be able to stay somewhere safe. And that as a baseline, right, to create these networks, it gives people the capacity to understand, like, okay, this is what we're making. This is the thing that we are going to try to build and continue building. And when Operation Metro Surge started in December, January, all of those houses of worship and many of those mutual aid networks right back up. Right. And so when people were not able to go and work because they were afraid of being picked up by ICE, the churches were the places they were going.
It also makes me think of the work of an organization like Culse Aid, who we have good relationships with here, and just thinking about anytime there's kind of a natural disaster in the world or a political crisis in the world,
Yeah.
oftentimes the first people showing up are calls to aid, to bring food. Even when the floods happened on the mainland, the flooding happened on the mainland,
They were,
it was call
Yeah.
to aid with their personal helicopters in the community going in and bringing in water and food. So kind of bringing that mutual aid work and kind of social justice work together with the tenets of Sikhi, right? At the heart of which is langar.
right,
And that langar isn't just this thing that you get at the Gurdwara. And it can be any, food service really, when
Right.
people need to be fed, with food that is accessible and equal to all, right?
in early days of COVID, like Langar was one of the few ways that people were getting fed during lockdown too, right? All the Gurdwaras had like drive up Langar.
Yeah. And I loved it. I have a friend who is a major kind of contributor to Khalsa Aid in Canada. And it was great. He came into one of my classes one time and everybody thought, okay, well, langar is the tin dish with the
Mhm.
specific foods and the yogurt and dal and whatever. He's like, no, it can be a burger and fries.
Yeah.
Like langar, do you want a burger? Is that what you need right now? Then we'll bring you a burger and fries. And that was so significant to my students too, to try to think, well, like
It's
to keep
culturally
it apart.
appropriate food.
Yeah.
Regardless.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whatever is culturally appropriate food or whatever food is necessary in the moment. Yeah, and like, again, COVID as an example, Gurdwaras were bringing pizzas,
Mhm.
right, to nurses on 26-hour shifts, So it's also about like easy access, transportability. It's like, how will people be fed best and most easily?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vegetarian burgers to be.
Thanks very much for that talk. I'm really glad Rachel just asked that question because my question really dovetails really nicely with yours. So in one sense, ethnographically, one could do this kind of analysis of the Italian community, Mennonite community, Jewish community, Serbian community. I'm sure just insert any community here and you could say, well, look at the way the Greeks are with their food. It's very important. It seems to be important to them and they like to share it. That's cool. But apropos of Rachel's observation, Sikhs have an edge on everybody, it seems to me. But yeah, like the Serbians and Slovakian community, I'm sure they have their thing around food, but it's the Sikhs who show up with a helicopter in the flood.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you can reflect on why it's almost like a conspicuous kind of sharing,
Yes.
right? I'm not trying to be suspicious when I say that, but it's so far beyond what everybody else is doing, even though everyone else has lovely feelings about charity and kindness and sharing and Unitarians, everyone does. So that's one question. The second question is just a trivial technical question. You used the word technology a few times.
Mm.
The technologies of.
Mm.
I wonder what you meant about that because you were talking about food waste. It's kind of like technologies. I'm wondering what's packed into that metaphor. So first one is kind of a riff on Rachel's question.
I mean, I think it goes back to, I will say, okay, so I've named that my dad is an atheist. I'm learning Sikhi with my family and on my own. So I do not claim to be any expert. I feel very, like, it's very important for me to name that. But the idea that we are committed to the well-being of everybody is real. It is not sort of a passive notion that's just in scripture sometimes. It is something that you are meant to feel and act on a daily basis. And like I said, the Gurdwara is built facing north, south, east, and west, so everybody knows they're welcome. It is that conspicuousness, I think, is, we mean it, we swear. Like, don't actually think that you can't get your needs met. It is going to be so clear to everybody that if you go to a Gurdwara, you will be cared for, right? And I think that's part of why. It's also, I would like, it's an imperative. It's an imperative of the faith. And like you said, it's an imperative of many faiths. But we're closer to the beginning of our faith, right? So I think it maybe hasn't necessarily, like, some of the tenets are still very visible and practiced more consistently and conspicuously than perhaps in other faiths where they have been able to become more sectarian, like they have devolved into sects that have more specific approaches. Not to say that hasn't happened, but I think that's part of it. I think it's just an understanding that this is what we are meant to do. And like, as again, somebody who did not grow up going to Gurdwara every week, who did not grow up having language for scripture, I knew that. And I think that piece is important, right? Like, it was just clear, like my grandparents, the minute anybody came to our farm, my granddad was giving them food. The minute, like, there's a whole network in the area that our farm is, where everybody shares the things they grow with the people who don't have the resources to eat. And so it's also just in the daily practices that people do. But I think the reason I use the word technology consistently is to resist the idea that the things that have come before something like technology aren't absolutely integral to the ways that we do our world and life. Because the AI of everything makes it feel as though this is some sort of revolution in a direction, but all of the things that our people created for us to survive well before are also technologies. And so I think that that's language that I draw on, because I think one of the best things colonialism did was tell us we didn't have culture. One of the smartest things they did was tell us that our language wasn't good enough. One of the, and so I think naming those things as technologies that we have been forced to forget, that we have been forced to refuse of ourselves, feels important in a world where we are being told that there is only one way to be, and only one way to be doing culture correctly. I don't know if that's like a whole enough answer, but
That's pretty good.
moving towards.
Can I ask a follow-up question to the first question? Because I wonder if so I appreciate your answer to the first question. Doesn't quite satisfy though, it seems to me, not just me, but I'm not sure. So again, Anglicans think the same thing.
Right.
And
I'm saying scripturally, I can't give you an answer.
No,
I don't.
I'm an anthropologist. I don't care if it's scripture. I mean, well, sorry, that's not the right way to put it. It's not.
Is that safe to say in this?
It's not my primary go-to source of authority. And so here's where I go, and I wonder what you think about this. But kind of, if we think about the origin of the Langar and the symbolic centrality of it in Sikh history, it has to do with saying we are different from Muslims and Hindus because look,
we all eat at the same
together.
table.
And this is a fundamental, radical thing to do. Yeah. And if we keep doing it, wherever Sikh communities show up in the world, we keep doing this. We keep reminding people we share radically, we share daily, and we share across caste. So it seems to me it's become this kind of niche identity marker for the community in a way that it's not among Anglicans or Baha'is or Buddhists. Again, which each of them, I'm sure I could do an ethnography of their food practices, and I'm sure they're all lovely. But there's something about Sikh communities' foregrounding of this sharing, cross-caste sharing, especially, which is central to it. So I'm trying to repoliticize the centrality of food rather than making it abstract or lost in the mists of history, but rather to say, it seems to me to be comprehensible only through a historical lens, not scripture, but a historical lens.
Right. Which is why I said, like, everybody can get fed, everybody can get housed, right? Is the idea that in spite of persecution, in spite of being asked to forcibly convert all of these things, right? Sikhs are not meant to, and I'm saying like individuals, obviously, Sikhs are not meant to see themselves at odds with other people simply because of who they are, right? And that is a refusal that is fundamental. And the way that we eat, like you said, everybody together on the floor, regardless of gender also, right? Is a way for everybody to be the same in terms of power. And it's a refusal of hierarchy that I think is really, really, really important, and that you named really well. Yeah.
And it's fascinating that this like niche sort of hyper fixation on this food practice as identity comes out of a critique of the food practices of those other identities, right? Like it's at
the
heart.
cleanliness practices.
The cleanliness practices, the no, very specific caste-based things, but even within Islam, the very specific sort of like food regulations that would have existed there. So it's like the very like like central food identity marker is actually a critique of those other food identity markers at its heart, right? So
Yeah, when I independently chose to be vegetarian in my teens, my dad said, but why? We don't have food specific markers, right? Like, you don't have to be vegetarian.
right,
And
you
so,
have to do that.
yeah, he was upset at me.
Okay, go ahead.
I am coming on Friday, so if there's somebody like online or something.
Right, is there an online question? Any? Looks like it's all you, Kate.
Great. So I'm curious, you talked a lot about your food and your culture through your dad's family, and I absolutely understand why you would do that. I'm wondering what you learned about food and culture and feeding and food as justice through your mom's family. And because you also do feminist studies, I'm curious, what might have been different if it had been your mom's family that had been Punjabi, because so much of like food and cooking and language and religion often comes through the mom. And so, yeah, I'm curious about those things.
Yeah, that is it's a set of very interesting questions. You all are learning so much about me today. My parents were divorced when I was 1, and my dad was my primary caregiver. So he actually did the majority of the cooking when I was growing up, and he did not know how to cook. He moved to the US for grad school and didn't know how to cook. And so called my grandmother long distance or wrote letters, like asked for recipes and cooking advice via letters, and learned how to cook from her. So he was still the person who was feeding me primarily as a child. My mother's family is very, very, very Minnesota. And I say Minnesota. And so we had our own, everybody has their own like specific things, but there's something about Minnesota that's also very specific to this question, in that it was settled by Nordic folks who were largely Lutheran, and Lutheran social services became the primary refugee resettlement organization in the United States over time. So the Lutheran Church actually facilitates the vast majority of refugee resettlement into the US at various points. And so like the Vietnamese refugee community, Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees are brought overwhelmingly to the Twin Cities because of the Lutheran Church. And so I think there's something also very Minnesotan about this idea of like feeding people, gathering and caring for folks, because refugee resettlement was done and is still done in like individual homes. So individual families bring in families and then consistently gather like at sites of worship to come together and create community. And that's something I observed growing up too. And so like the potluck and the hot dish, I don't know if any of you know what a hot dish is. It's noodles plus Campbell's baked with other things.
Tater tots.
And tater tots, yes, we have tater tot dish.
Yeah.
Tater hot dish is classic.
Yeah.
But that like
Yeah.
feeding people in vats at the, at the house of worship was something that was consistent throughout my childhood. And so I think like something very Minnesotan too, actually, about these ideas, certainly not from the same standpoint necessarily, but yeah.
But also food is care and food is justice.
Fundamentally, yes. And like inevitably, like you will be fed. Right? It's the same idea regardless. Yeah. And I think that's part of how Minneapolis, like the Twin Cities really mobilized so quickly in 2020. And then now too, is because of those, right? The church pantries and Sunday dinners and the Friday fresh fries during Lent and things like that.
Well, thank you, Simi. We're at the hour, so that you're starting.
Thank you.
And that's it for us this year. So we'll see you back in September when we get into our next event of Six Talks. So have a great summer, everyone.